Of all the different characters that we talk about when we look at ancient Egypt, the one who seems to capture the imagination the most is probably King Tutankhamun. And this is really kind of ironic. It's kind of interesting how famous he is and how well known he is when you really consider and look at his place in history. King Tut, as we kind of tend to affectionately refer to him, was really a very minor king. This is a guy who he did rule for about 10 years, but he was only 8 years old when he first came to power and died at 18. And for much of that time, he really wasn't ruling the country. He, had regents, etc., that really kind of ran everything for him. We'll talk more about that in a moment as well. But a little bit about Tut's background, about who he is and where he comes from. We've talked about Akhenaten, also known as Amenhotep IV, and the tremendous changes that he made to Egyptian culture and religion. And this wasn't particularly well received by much of the Egyptian people, particularly, of course, by the priests of the other cults, such as Amun-Ra. So we don't know for sure how Amenhotep IV, or Akhenaten's reign, ended. But when it did end, the kingship was left to this 8-year-old boy, who is believed to be, in fact, the actual son, to be the physical child of Akhenaten. So we do know that a couple of other guys were in the picture. A vizier named Ai, and also another man by the name of Horemheb, that were part of the royal court. More than likely were the ones who were really kind of running the show, especially when Tut was quite young. Eventually, Tut kind of comes into his own and begins to assert his own power, and suddenly, at age 18, Tut dies, and there's a lot of mystery surrounding his death. Many people theorize, in fact, that he may have been murdered, possibly even in something as elaborate as a staged chariot accident. So we don't know for certain, but a lot of fingers do point back at both Ai and Horemheb. Now, we do know that Tut is the only Egyptian king whose tomb has ever been discovered in a pristine, unlooted situation, and that's what's really unusual about this. In 1922, an Egyptologist named Howard Carter discovered the tomb, and it had been overlooked and missed because another tomb that had been raided in antiquity and excavated later, all of the rubble that had been dug out and cut out from that area covered the entrance to Tut's tomb in the Valley of the Kings. And so this was finally excavated, and Carter found this site, and they were quite shocked when they found the tomb and found that it was still sealed. When they looked inside, they were really quite shocked at what they found. And we'll take a look here at some images of what they actually saw when they looked inside of the tomb itself. So here in this picture, you can see stacks and stacks of goods that were placed within the tomb of Tut in the first chamber. And a lot of this is kind of the traditional stuff that you would expect. You've got, you would have, all sorts of grave goods, canopic jars and other items, of course, and a sarcophagus in another space that we'll see in a moment. But there are really two classifications of items that were found in the tomb of Tut. Some of these are items that were actually used by the king during his life, including a chariot, a complete chariot, which was dismantled and placed within the tomb, and a large number of walking sticks. And this is a little bit interesting because this tells us that Tut may have suffered from some sort of physiological issues which required him to walk with a cane or with a stick of some sort. And again, this may get back to some of the things we talked about previously with the disfigurement, the potential disfigurement anyway, of Akhenaten, and with the inbreeding that we certainly see as commonplace within the Egyptian royal family at this period in history. We can also see funerary couches and all sorts of other goods. It was a tremendously rich find. The amount of gold and precious materials found within this space are incredible, especially when you consider the fact that we're looking at the burial, the tomb, of a very unimportant king. This only begs the question that when we talk about some of the other really key and important rulers of the Egyptian world, Ramses II, who rules for 67 years, what would the grave goods look like from his tomb had they been undisturbed? Tut's tomb appears to have been put together really in a big hurry. Apparently, his death was really quite unexpected. He was very young. And more than likely, the tomb of another member of the royal family was preempted for use for his burial. Other than this, it was prepared in a somewhat normal fashion in terms of decoration, although a bit hastily, and his embalming was certainly done in a very hasty manner. But we have the typical decorations around the perimeter of the walls of the tomb, including a few that are a little unusual, including ones that show members of the royal court helping with the process of the burial, including Ai and Horemheb. And Ai, in fact, conducts the opening of the mouth ceremony. And this is maybe even a little more suspicious, given the fact that he may be, in fact, responsible, according to some theories, for the death of Tut. So here we can see, again, some of the grave goods, and in the back there you can see a massive structure. And that, in fact, is part of the outer sarcophagus that Tut was interred within. Here in this image we can see Howard Carter himself opening one of the sarcophagi of King Tut. And these were really complicated things. He was nestled within a series of several sarcophagi. The outermost of these were made of cedar and then covered in gold leaf. Different colors of gold, different alloys of gold to create flesh tones and other things. And these were layered over this cedar in this massive structure. And within that there was another wooden and gold leaf sarcophagus. And finally you get down deep enough and they found another one within that explained something for them that had been a little confusing. See, they had attempted to move these outer sarcophagi and they discovered that it took 8 strong men to budge it. And this was really kind of confusing because the outer sarcophagus, again, is made of wood covered in gold leaf. It doesn't weigh that much. And the next one, same thing. And they finally get down a little deeper, and what they find is an inner sarcophagus that weighs 1/4 of a ton, made of beaten gold, solid gold. The whole thing had been covered with a pitch, with a resin to seal it together, so it was incredibly difficult, and they had to scrape and heat it and do all sorts of things to it in order to get it to finally open and release. And then, of course, once they found the interior, then they found the remains of Tut and some other additional, really astonishing artifacts. In this image here, we can see the innermost of the sarcophagi of Tut. It's about 6 foot 1 inches in length, covered in enamel, semi-precious stones, of course, and, as mentioned previously, made of gold. And this is just an incredibly rich and incredibly extravagant object. And again, we have to put this into context and think about what we're looking at here is an object from a rushed burial from a minor king. So this is the final death mask that would have been placed over the head of Tut within his sarcophagus. And once again, we can see the inlay here of lapis and other semi-precious stones and the really masterful gold work. In terms of the style, as soon as Akhenaten is out, much of Egypt returns back to the old ways. The old cults are reestablished. Much of that happens under the reign of Tut, but some of the Amarna conventions are still visible within his tomb and within his grave goods. And it takes a little bit of time before all of those really revert back. We still see for a little bit of time there, in royal tombs in particular, some of the conventions from the Amarna period, such as some of the proportional lengths of the body, still are slightly different, and it takes a little while for those to all get back to the stylistic tendencies we see before this period. This is the back of the head covering of the death mask of Tut, and you can see it's covered and inscribed there with hieroglyph, and of course these are probably passages which relate to the transition for the king into the afterlife. This chest here is a painted chest from his tomb, which would have contained his canopic jars. And Tut is actually shown, he's on his chariot, he's shown on wall paintings, he's shown in this chest here as being a tremendous warrior. And of course this is in keeping with the image of the king, probably more so than with any reality. But here he is shown defeating Nubians and Syrians and, of course, animals. A tradition, a concept that goes all the way back to what we see with the ancient Assyrians. So, as mentioned, Tut's reign is really quite short-lived. And after Tut dies, Ai becomes the king for a brief period of time, then Horemheb. But Horemheb has no children, he doesn't have any offspring. And so his vizier, who eventually takes the name Ramses, becomes king. Now, Ramses goes about the process of continuing to turn everything back to the way that it was prior to the Amarna period in terms of conventions, in terms of the reestablishment of the cults of the old gods and everything else. But his reign is also quite short. And his son becomes his successor, and his son is named Seti the First. So Seti has also a child, and this guy we know today as Ramses the Second. So Ramses the Second ends up becoming king after Seti the First, and Ramses the Second rules for a total, as I've mentioned, of 67 years, and has tremendous numbers of offspring. He has as much as 100 children, according to some accounts. And during his lifespan, he is known for putting his mark on an incredible number of really important Egyptian structures and artifacts. Some of the things that he's best known for include the building of a temple at Abu Simbel that we'll take a look at, and also his additions that we see at Luxor and Karnak. So here in this image, what we're looking at is the temple of Ramses II at Abu Simbel. And there's a couple things you need to know about this that are really kind of key. First off, Abu Simbel is not located anywhere near really the major urban centers or religious centers of the Egyptian world. It is all the way down south, practically on the border with Nubia. And this is done for a couple of reasons. One, the Nubians were the military enemy of the Egyptians, and Ramses, by the way, was also well known for a very large number of pretty significant military campaigns. But Ramses II had this structure created for a couple of reasons. One of these is to intimidate the Nubians. Seeing this massive structure looming off of your border was really a pretty powerful statement made by Ramses about his abilities and about the strength of the Egyptian empire. When you consider the fact that these images, these statues that we're looking at here of Ramses seated, and there are 4 of him seated here, they measure 65 feet in height seated, is really pretty tremendous. Also, this is not a constructed stone temple, but it's a rock-cut, living stone temple. So it was actually carved directly out of the face of a mountain, which again is a pretty astonishing feat. Now, another element of this that's also really kind of important is part of the rationale for why it is placed where it is because Ramses does something pretty outlandish with this. This whole temple, the way that it's put together, the way the inner chambers are structured, and the way that he is represented go way beyond simply stating that he's a powerful king. What this temple really says, what it indicates, is that Ramses is a god on earth. Now, we know that the Egyptian kings, when they die, traditionally are deified. They're worshipped by a funerary cult. They're associated with Osiris and death, and so, and Amun-Ra as well. And so this is, normal that when they die, they become a god. Well, Ramses doesn't wait for death. Ramses decides that he is a god on earth right now. And this temple is one of the things that represents that. It does so in a couple of ways. Of course, you have these massive figures on the exterior. And by the way, Ramses' wife is also depicted using hierarchical scale. If you'll note, she is standing between his ankles in each of the 4 statues. So you get an idea there of her relative importance. But here in this next image, you can see the interior of the temple. And we have these massive Atlantids. An Atlantid is essentially a statue, a column in the shape of a man. And these represent Ramses in the guise of Osiris. So once again, he's still alive here, but he is already usurping the role of one of the major gods here. They don't really have any load-bearing function, so they're not really true columns in this case. But they're these massive statues that line the entranceway inside of the temple. Another image here, you can see them on the interior, and also because of the people in here, it gives you a little bit of a better idea of scale. Now, one other thing I'll mention about this is that you can kind of see it all the way in the back. At the far end, there's another chamber down there. And in that chamber, there are 4 seated individuals. Now, 3 of these are gods, traditional gods of the Egyptian pantheon with which we are familiar. But the 4th figure, who's seated with the gods at the same scale, is in fact Ramses II. And this temple is designed in such a way that at the right time of the year, at the right time of the day, the sun, as it rises, fires a ray of light all the way down the center of this temple, straight through. And that beam of light falls directly onto Ramses II. So in addition to his temple at Abu Simbel, Ramses is also really quite well known for his additions to and for his responsibilities in terms of creation at the site of Karnak and Luxor. So a little bit of background first about Karnak and Luxor and what this is really all about. This is a sacred site. It's a very old site. In fact, we know that there were temples built there as early as the Middle Kingdom. And they were added to and added to and added to and torn down on occasion. We'll get to that as well. But these temples were built onto as late as into the Ptolemaic period. So the temple complex here at Luxor and Karnak is actually the largest ancient religious site in the world, and it's just absolutely massive. If you visit there today, only a part of it, the precinct of Amun-Ra, is accessible, but there are a total of 4 precincts. But again, many of these are things you can't get into today, like, for example, the precinct of Mut or the destroyed temple or precinct of Amenhotep IV. And that, of course, this is also Akhenaten, same guy. So he had his own set of temples built there during the process of his reign and the worship of the Aten. But the primary function of these sites, of this massive set of temples, was really intended to focus on something called the Opet Festival. And the Opet Festival was an annual festival during which Amun-Ra and his consort Mut reenacted their marriage, essentially, their wedding. And by the way, this was also an important period in time for the king, because during this process, one of the things that happens is the king would take part in some of the ceremonies and the ceremonial activities, and it was a reaffirmation of kingship, of the divinity of the office of kingship. And so there was a lot of pomp and circumstance involved with that process as well. Now, there are really 2 major temples. The one that we're looking at here is, again, Amun-Ra, the precinct of Amun-Ra. It was connected by a long causeway, about 2 miles long, to another building, another set of buildings, at the site of Luxor. And so what would occur is that during the Opet festival is that a sacred boat containing the images of the gods of Amun-Ra and his consort Mut would be transported from Karnak to Luxor. And again, this was part of this festival, which not only served the kings and the gods, but was also part of a large spectacle during the flooding of the Nile on an annual basis. So another image here, we can see the remains of one of the components, a large element of the precinct of Amun-Ra. And again, much of this is really significantly in ruin, but here we can see some of the best preserved components of it. Now, religious observation here took place in a manner, in a way that was not really particularly egalitarian. So the average Egyptian never really set foot within the walls of these precincts. You'd be on the exterior. It was really only for members of the royal family, for the upper class, for the priesthood to actually enter within any of these precincts. And even then, within those precincts, the temples themselves were incredibly exclusive. The many chambers, the farther back you got into the temple, the more exclusive they became, until finally they were only accessible by the high priest of the cult or by the king himself. And so these were, the Holy of Holies. These were really sacred to the Egyptian people. Now, architecturally, what occurs here, both at Luxor and at Karnak, is that over this very long, very extended period of time, again, ranging from the Middle Kingdom all the way to the Ptolemaic period, these various kings would engage in building processes and programs during their reign. And that would often include the addition of a new pylon or a new feature onto the temples here. The pylons are the large standing gateways, these big sloping gateways that would face a courtyard, open into a courtyard, or open onto a hall area. And often these, again, were commissioned by specific individual kings or pharaohs. Ramses and his predecessor, Seti I, are really best known for the construction of something called the hypostyle hall, the Hall of Amun-Ra. And in this image here, you can actually see parts of that, and you can see some of the means of which that is constructed. We'll look at that a little more closely here too, but The hypostyle hall is essentially a series of these massive columns, these huge columns. And these columns support architraves up above, these massive beams that would have supported the roof. And it's estimated that the beams on top of these columns, the architraves themselves, weigh somewhere in the neighborhood of about 70 tons apiece. So this is really a truly massive structure. Another view here, also again, of the Temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak. You can also still see the hypostyle hall there. One of the things you'll notice when you look at it from this angle is that you can see that it is higher in the middle. And what you're looking at there in that raised component is what's called a clerestory. And so the Egyptians were the first people to invent this, to come up with the concept of the clerestory. And this is a really significant architectural innovation, one that will be very relevant into, for example, the Gothic period, the Romanesque period, as a way to allow light into very tall buildings. And what it means essentially is that the central component, the middle part of this temple is taller than the rest. And by doing this, by having a higher central section, by having this roof higher in the middle, they were allowed to leave openings, windows essentially, which would allow light to come into the building and illuminate what would otherwise be a very, very dark space. This is a plan view here, and you can again see in the middle there the forest of columns that represents the hypostyle hall of Amun-Ra, which was built by Seti I and Ramses II. And you can also see again in the darker shaded areas where the massive pylons are located. And again, these go all the way back to the Middle Kingdom. Some of the earlier parts actually from the New Kingdom were created and restored, in fact, by someone we've talked about not that long ago. When we talked about Queen Hatshepsut, she left a significant mark here in the Temple of Karnak. Another pylon here, and this gives you a better idea of what I'm talking about when I refer to these large sloping gateways. And so these pylons were the entranceways into the different sacred precincts. Often they were fronted by statuary, as you can see here, and obelisks. One of these obelisks is located in New York today, so many of these, another in Paris. So many of these obelisks from the ancient world have been removed and taken to different locations. So in this overview, you can see a much larger view of the entire area. We can see the precinct of Amun, the larger area up above on top there, and you can see, again, the scale of this. We've already kind of taken a moment to look at how big, for example, that hypostyle hall is. Here you can see the overall larger version of the precinct. You can also see the sacred lake located up there. Again, the oldest parts of this that go all the way back to the Middle Kingdom were associated with Mut, who was a fertility and an earth god, really. And it refers to the creation, to the initial creation of the Egyptian world. And so that's kind of the primordial waters where everything comes from. So all of this is connected by a causeway to the Nile and also by a very long causeway referred to as the Avenue of the Sphinxes down to the Temple of Luxor. And the Avenue of the Sphinxes was in fact lined its entire 2-mile length with sphinxes. And so this is really a pretty tremendous and pretty amazing sight for anyone to go and see. This is in fact the second most popular tourist destination in Egypt today. So here we have a view of the interior of the hypostyle hall. This gives you some idea again of scale. We have someone walking through there, so you can get some perspective in terms of just how massive these columns actually are. Now, interestingly, some of these columns are slightly unfinished. There's a couple in particular that are really quite rough cut, and this gives us some clue as to how these may have been created. It's certainly possible that massive ramps were created, used to slide these architraves up on top of the columns. The columns were placed and stacked essentially as rough-cut drums and then finished. But another interesting theory involves a whole lot of dirt. One of the theories is that this area was cleared, leveled, paved, and then the bases of these columns were placed. And once the bases were placed, the theory goes that more dirt was hauled in by the workmen and filled up to the top of the edge of each of these platform bases. And once the dirt was filled in up to that height, that the next course of drums were transported in place. And then that was filled in with dirt. And then the next course of drums, and on and on and on, all the way up. So this would represent a tremendous feat of engineering at any rate. but the theory goes that after all of that dirt was placed and the final beams were brought in, that it was simply excavated. And as it was excavated, the workmen carved and finished the columns. But somewhere along the way, apparently they missed a couple. So there's really a lot of different possible theories. We don't know exactly how this structure was created. Like many of these ancient Egyptian structures and artifacts, there's quite a bit of mystery that still surrounds how it was made. Another view here of the hypostyle hall of Amun-Ra, and on the exterior you can see some of the negative relief which was left, and much of this relief depicts the military grandeur of Ramses II. Another view here, and again you can get an idea on scale. You can see the lotus blossom capitals at the very top there of these incredibly massive columns. In this drawing, you can get a better idea here as well of what the clerestory may have looked like. You can see the raised central section with the lotus capitals. You can see the bud capitals on either side, or the shorter ones. And you can see the open grill work there that would have allowed light to flood into the structure. So another interesting artifact we can look at from this period in history, the royal scribe and steward of Seti I was a guy by the name of Hu-Nefer. And what we're looking at here is in fact a detail, part of the last judgment of Hu-Nefer from his tomb at Thebes. So this was done on a painted papyrus scroll, and what we're really looking at here is an excerpt from the Book of the Dead. We can see Hu-Nefer on the left with Anubis, then the weighing of the heart ceremony, and then we can also see Hu-Nefer being presented, right over there on the right-hand side, to Osiris as he's being presented by Horus. And so again, this shows us this whole process of the judgment that would take place for an Egyptian after their death, before they are allowed really to enter the afterlife. So with the end of the New Kingdom, we really see pretty much the end of the Egyptian civilization as a unified body as we look at it during the ancient world. After the end of the New Kingdom, we see power fragment, and we see Upper and Lower Egypt once again split. And then we see a period of history of really just filled with civil war, with unrest, with invasion. We have the rise of the Kushite kings in the south. We have all sorts of problems with the Assyrians invading. And we do have a brief period called the Late Period, where the Egyptians managed to reassert local control and power for a period of time. But then this is followed by Persian invasion. And eventually the Persians take control, and we even have a period referred to as Achaemenid Egyptian history. And this is, of course, followed by the Ptolemies, by the Greeks, by Alexander the Great. And after that, Egypt eventually becomes a Roman possession. And so with the end of the New Kingdom, we really see the end of ancient Egypt as a historical and as an artistic center. But we have one final artwork that we'll look at here. So in this last artwork that we're looking at, and you can see this is quite late in the Egyptian historical record. This is from 650 BCE. And this is a statue, a funerary statue from Karnak. This is Mentehemet. And not life-size, it's quite a bit less, only 4'5" in height. But what's really interesting about this is that we started our study looking at ancient Egypt about 2,000 years prior to this. And if we compare this statue to artworks from the beginning of that historical period, if we were to compare this and put it side by side, for example, with the image of Menkaure with his wife Khmerennebti, we would see striking similarities in the posture, in the means of representation, in the manner in which all of this is conveyed. And one of the things that this shows us is this incredible sense, again, of permanence, the lasting set of developments in terms of artistic conventions and the canon that the Egyptians established. This will have a tremendous impact later on the Greeks. Much of Greek concepts in terms of statuary derives from Egyptian archetypes, and we'll be seeing that in a future.